Welcome to today's episode, Safety in the Science Lab, What You Need to Know. I'm Mrs. Schecker, your science teacher this year. Take a look at each of these icons here. Make your best guess as to which aspect of lab safety each icon addresses. We'll revisit these in the next few slides. If you'd like to, you can pause the video now. Now for some of our general lab safety rules. First and foremost, you'll hear this often. Always follow the teacher's directions and only do lab work when a teacher is present. So that means if I'm not in the classroom, you're not permitted to enter. Always conduct yourself in a responsible manner at all times. No horseplay. Do not touch any equipment, chemicals, or other materials until told to do so. Do not eat food, drink beverages, or chew gum in the lab. Also, and this one seems kind of obvious, but do not use lab glassware as food or beverage containers. Don't come into class and, pour your Powerade or whatever into a beaker. And it's just not safe. And finally, report all accidents, no matter how big or small, to your teacher immediately, even if you think it is minor. Moving into the clothing that is required for our labs, you'll see that the individual on the right is showing the correct way to wear lab safety gear. You need to wear goggles and safety glasses, closed-toed shoes, we'll trust that she has them on. Need to tie back long hair that you have, girls or boys, and glasses are preferred over contacts. Do not wear under any circumstances sandals, any long flowing jewelry, or loose or baggy clothing, including your bishop hoodie. A few more safety guidelines on the day of the experiment. Notify your teacher immediately of any accidents or unsafe conditions in the science classroom. Are you starting to notice a trend here? After any experiment, wash your hands with soap and water. Lucky for us, our classroom is equipped with 2 sinks on the right side of our room. Now for a little bit of a brain break, take a look at our classroom. How many pieces of safety equipment can you identify in this room? If you'd like to, you can pause the video now. That picture actually had 3 pieces of safety equipment: the first aid kit, the fire extinguisher, and the fire blanket. Not pictured were the eye wash and the goggles. In class tomorrow, we'll go over specifically where we can find each of these pieces of safety equipment. Now, for some tips that will be specific to certain labs we'll do this year. If at any point we're working with sharp objects, remember that when you're using knives or something else like a scalpel, always walk with the points facing down. Also, cut in the direction away from your fingers and your body. Never put a pointed object towards your body. For electrical safety, this is especially important for our class because we have our laptops out often. Number 1, do not place a cord where someone can trip over it. It's important that you're plugging in your laptop to the outlet that is closest to your desk. Never ever use electricity around water. This is very, very important that if we're doing a lab, any water is far away from your cords. Finally, whenever you finish your lab, be sure to unplug all equipment before leaving the room. This includes microscopes and, of course, your laptop. If we ever do a lab where we're handling living organisms, there's a few things we need to keep in mind. If we're handling living organisms, make sure that you are only doing this with my permission. Always treat living organisms humanely. This is relatively obvious and is absolutely expected. Be sure, after handling any animals, that you wash your hands with soap and water at the sinks in our classroom. Also, you might be handling plants throughout this year. First, do not eat any plants in the lab. This holds true for any sort of lab material we use this year. Also, just as with animals, be sure to wash your hands after handling the plants. Now, for our last set of safety guidelines for labs we may do this year. We most likely will not be working with too many chemicals this year, but if we are, and a chemical spills on your skin, notify me immediately and be sure to rinse with water for 15 minutes. It is likely that we will work with glassware this year. Be sure to carry all glassware carefully with 2 hands. Finally, if we're working with food items, which we will at least a few times this year, or if we do any dissections, you must be wearing gloves during the lab. And finally, a little bit more about glass safety. If glass breaks during our class, be sure to notify me immediately. I will clean it up using a special glass disposal container. Broken glassware should never be disposed of in a classroom trash can. In the unlikely event that there is an accident or an injury in our class, these are things you need to do. If there's any sort of eye accident, wash the eye with copious or large amounts of water for at least 15 minutes at the eye wash. If there is any sort of fire burn, you need to stop, drop, and be covered with a fire blanket or soaked with water. Again, these are all very, very unlikely, but necessary to discuss. Finally, if there's any cuts and or you're bleeding, first be sure not to touch anyone else if you are bleeding. If someone else is bleeding, make sure not to touch them without first wearing safety gloves. And of course, as with everything else, notify me immediately if there's this sort of injury. Now that we've covered some of the basics of lab safety, take a look at this picture. There are at least 6 things wrong with this picture. Tomorrow in class, we'll review this picture as well as 2 others to see how many lab safety violations we can identify. If you'd like, you can pause the video now. You've now learned some of the most important lab safety guidelines for our class this year. Remember, carefully read through the entire safety contract and sign it. You are responsible for knowing and adhering to all lab safety guidelines listed in that contract. Have your parents read and sign your lab safety contract too. This will be due on Friday when you come to class. Also, study for the safety quiz, which will be on Friday of this week, the same day that your lab safety contract is due. As always, see Mrs. Schecker if you have questions. Until next time, have a great day.